Sick. All right. So basic defensive theory. I've got these concepts, and they're very part of the reason I want to do this is that they're very vague, and I want to help other people understand like my thought processes, and also help myself flesh them out a bit, right? And so I have like a 3-leveled defensive tier that I kind of look for. Like I look to recognize when I'm in these positions. They aren't really something that I do on purpose. It's not like I build a deck and I tell myself this deck is going to have level 2 defense. It's more like these are just the situations, and the levels aren't necessarily like more extreme, but they kind of are. And so the number one thing, this is actually defensive autopilot. That's actually sort of what this is. Instead of theory, this is like a basic defensive autopilot. Is probably a more accurate way to put it. So when it comes down to it, the first thing you have to do is you have to identify what you can hold. So level 0 is sort of like the cards left over level, right? This is cards left over. So when this happens, let's get a little bulletin point in here. I don't know. Let's just do that. Yeah. When is early game, turns 1 and 2, and it's usually the non-foundations left in my hand, right? So the first turn you're gonna build, and this is why it's level 0. You don't really get to choose, right? You don't really get to sculpt your hand. You don't have a ton of choices you get to make. Usually you're looking for a hand that has 2 or less attacks, and you're going to build every single thing, right? And this is vastly different between going first and going second. I can probably shrink this font down a bit. Keep this on the screen together, right? Oh, it's going to do everything. All right, fuck it. So it's vastly different going first or second. So these are the cards left over. And so what I'm looking to do is I'm prioritizing staying alive. But to do that we have to make sure that we are more inclined to full block. Fully blocking attacks, right? Ooh. And blocking attacks with bonuses. Now this is just generally like the good idea anyway, but if you are up against a character like Kirishima 2 dot, right? Or really both, they both put +2 damage on something twice. If you're playing against Kirishima, or you're playing against like a Sato, right? Or you're playing against a 4th kind, you're gonna try and prioritize blocking those attacks that have bonuses. And that seems super obvious, right? But it is really tough when you have a high and a low block and you're looking at your opponent, right? And they go back alley haymaker, put no stats on it. You don't want to block this anyway. They play their second attack. It's a hardened frenzy, and they've put +2 damage from Kirishima on it. Now you got to think to yourself, right? Like, I don't want them to rebuild it. I don't want them to just bring it back down and pick it back up, recur it somehow. And typically, in later stages of the game, you're probably not going to block this unless you have a wall cling or a faith shield, something like that. But on that turn 2, if I have the 1 high block and the hardened frenzy, right? Like we're not afraid of Texas Smash. This becomes the mini game. The mini game becomes, if you leave hardened frenzy there, you're probably not going to see a Texas Smash because it doesn't combo frenzy. And so he's probably not going to play another high attack other than frenzy. And so you have to identify the fact that we normally would prioritize our high blocks for Texas Smash because it's going to be 9 damage instead of 7 most of the time, and it's buffing the next one, and it doesn't build itself down. It's usually 1 slower speed, yada yada yada. On that turn 2, if it's coming after a punch attack already, like yes, you might open yourself up for that combo, but more than likely it's going to be your only opportunity to use that high block. And it's going to be the only time where you can sort of not take that damage. So it is not always the right call, but when we're at our level 0 autopilot defense, we're mostly just trying to match block zones, right? And I have on like 6 hand size, like tankier characters, this is where it becomes really cool, where you can just sort of face tank and, use super regen life gaining tricks. Those are super important against cards like Hardened Frenzy. But for the most part, a lot of the time, it's okay to block it turn 2. If they have to keep playing jabs and replay it at you, if you block the one that got the bonus damage, you've probably blocked the most damage that you can block. The other thing about this is extra review steps. Cards we don't want to play next turn. Right? Oh, okay. Keyboard freaking out. So cards we don't want to play next turn, right? Those are first on the chopping block. We might take a bad block here or there. But if you're only holding 2 cards, right? These are typically cards we have after building as much as we can. This is like the number one thing. If you don't want that card in your hand, you can probably take a bad block on it, because if they don't play any more attacks, you're going to miss out on reviewing both of these cards. So if it's like a home run comet that's not doing anything for you turn 2, probably is okay to partial block with that just to save some life, So level 0, we're prioritizing the first and foremost taking as little damage as possible, because these cards weren't useful to us when we can't attack. They're an action card we couldn't play, etc., etc. And you're gonna take like there's not a ton of posturing you get to do with 2 cards in hand. You'd have to have a really sick backswing and an insanely good telegraph, like a really obvious in to just want to hold all your cards on that turn 2. Most of the time, at least in my opinion, like Tokoyamis can get away with it. If a Tokoyami goes down to like 4 life and you're slinging mid attacks at him, something's up. It's scary. So these are usually 1 or 2 cards in hand. And I know this formatting is absolutely terrible, right? So that's level 0. And I think that if you just get a little looser, just play a little more. And when I say loose, I guess people would probably take more damage. Basically, like, just be willing to block early attacks, right? Like, you can get away with earlier blocks level 0, because level 1 is a little bit later in the game. You get a little more agency. And this is like my trap card defense. This is what I call the trap card defense. Best on turn 2, and but can be useful at any point, right? But it fades in effectiveness typically. A really good hand trap will win you a game all the time, but the trap card defense is almost always going to be turn 2 and involves powerful defensive tools and hand traps, right? These are your breaker 2, your cheerful uppercut, your evil gazes. This is where you can take a really bad block to get a bunch of tempo. This is where you can trade life to find the right opening. I do think people block with uppercuts and things like automatically early on. Like their first goal is to stop people from attacking us, and I don't think that that's really the way to use an uppercut, right? Like I almost never want to uppercut to ruin the first double jab pummel. I want to uppercut to ruin the second double jab pummel, if that makes sense, you know? Like, especially I see a lot of people partial block the first charge attack because they're like, oh, I'm going to ruin your combo and you won't get to string out, and it deters people. But there are, especially later games, like this is why it fades in effectiveness, right? Like turns 4, 5, and 6, they'll just play a charge attack on a 6 and then double jab pummel on a 7, and then that +2 bonus will let them tap one more to play another double jab, and then they'll probably tap out to play their kill card. But that's late game, right? Like that's so like early on they're just like, I can absolutely just no brain, zero thought process, autopilot jam that uppercut, right? And as we go up in levels, it's a little less autopilot. You know, as we go up in levels, this is still like the first thought process, the first idea. And it's about identifying when you're in this position. It's about knowing, like, is this hand trap actually going to help me in this situation, or is it just going to give my opponent an earlier out, right? It can really jam somebody once they've used a bunch of resources. I think late string uppercuts are underutilized, number one. I think hitting uppercut on the third attack actually way more impressive, gets you more value most of the time than doing it on the first attack. And so that's where like trading life to find the right opening really becomes important. Like if you need 2 home run comments to kill me and I partial the first one and it's your third attack, and that one difficulty makes you reconsider, gives you like a chance of failure, stuff like that, like that can be huge because you've gotten 2 more cards out of their hand than you would have if you blocked on the first one and they went, that's too much difficulty, right? So like, yes, both scenarios keep you alive, but one of them gets resources out of their hand, and it's about the backswing. It's all about the backswing, baby. So, you know, this is telegraphed setups for backswings. It's or I guess it doesn't have to be telegraphed. It's usually pretty telegraphed when you're using evil gaze and stuff like that. But this is primarily setups for backswings, and I think you should try to have a win condition in hand already. A lot of this is another thing I see a ton of people do, and I fell for it a lot when I was early in my career. You use your powerful defensive tool, especially early on. Your opponent goes, man, now I don't think I can kill you. Score, yes, I stayed alive. And then they build out, they hold their different cards, whatever. And I have 1 card in hand, it's a foundation. I review it, I draw 1 attack, I have no backswing, and I did not utilize that uppercut particularly well because I didn't know, that my opponent was really going to go deep and kill me, depending on what my life total is. And I probably had a whole bunch of life to work with. And just wanted to pop off that cool defensive ability because uppercut especially is most effective early on, right? Like it adds 1 difficulty for everything you play after that. So the earlier you get it down theoretically, the more value you get out of it. But that's only true if they tap foundations, right? If they lose resources to do so. And the resources they're going to lose from hand are generally going to be way less valuable than the attacks that you would have gotten if you just held out, right? So that's where we get to level 2, which level 2 is the stock market defense. This is where I lose most games. This is typically on the edge of deadlock. This is usually right when everybody shoots up to 10 foundations. They start asking, what's your deadlock? Where do you show your deadlock? You got any deadlock in your discard pile? You don't have any deadlock in your stage, right? What's your deadlock? What's the deadlock on this symbol, right? This is where we're at. We're at 10 foundations typically. Usually turns 3 and 4. Especially prevalent with 6-handers. This is the game 6-handers want to win. This is where, this is typically like 5-handers who get to this point or run into who run into the situation typically not in a winning position, but it's all very different. Like, hand size is not really archetype, right? So the stock market defensive autopilot prioritizes holding the win condition. This is one of the hardest things, right? This is part of sculpting. And it's really what makes Momo, I think, top tier right now. It's what makes Kirishima easy to pilot a bit. And it's what makes Momo like top tier. Is her once per turn can prioritize her win condition. It can sculpt it for her. And for this, you typically have to be... typically needs good board presence. You don't need a great hand. I don't know how to spell presence. You don't need a great hand if your board is scary, right? Like, the known information can deter your opponent from attacking you. Right? So if you have bad cards in hand and you're sculpting, right? You're sculpting, so you have bad defensive hand. It's all mid blocks. It's all, like, if your hand is like Cannon Blast, Home Run Comet, Back Alley Haymaker, you have +2 mid, +2 mid, +1 mid, +2 high, whatever, right? Like, you're not blocking shit low. You don't have the best block much. You're not building anything, right? Like, this is, in the context of Momo, most likely, you're not building any of these cards down, But your board state says that this opponent will have no chance of actually hitting you if you have the block mods. And when they don't attack you, you get paid for doing nothing. And this is, an introductory education of the stock market, but I'm pretty sure that getting paid for doing nothing is the goal. Get paid for doing nothing. This is the stock market defense in a nutshell. This is when I lost to JJ in Pasadena. This is where the Momo decks turn the corner, as it were, if you're a traditional MTG player, right? Like the control decks. Oh, thank you for the follow. I appreciate that. I'm trying to read the name. It's right on the edge where it turns green. But Ty Shadow, thank you. Thank you very much for the follow. I appreciate that. Let me move the alert box up a bit. There we go. That should be a better spot for it. But yeah, so the get paid for doing nothing is exactly where you want to be in most games, right? Like, it just sounds really good, but it's actually really hard to do. And the biggest reason is because typically it requires your opponent to not have super overkill, and it requires your opponent to not have a good economy of trading card for card. So if you're at full health and you have 4 attacks in your hand and they have 6 cards in hand, as long as they can't kill you with, like, as long as they can't start forcing you to block 3+ attacks, you will have half those attacks for your next turn. So you can plan around that, right? You can plan around having some of these attacks, and Again, especially if you're Momo, you get to add a block that you need instead, or a better attack. So they get paid for doing nothing doesn't necessarily mean that you have a great defensive hand, but it typically requires good board presence. It really gambles on your opponent not drawing well, right? On your opponent's draws. If we don't have a super great hand to attack into and we give our opponent value, that's been the talk all of season 1. That's why Kirishima 1 was so oppressive, because poking him was just too risky. Poking him did not yield many great results, right? So it kind of gambles on your opponent's draws, but at the same time is built by card advantage on board. Or reusable card advantage, yeah. Is built by a reusable card advantage usually. So passing the torch is probably the number one offender, right? E-commit, draw card, reusable. We do have Eraserhead's exhaustion card coming out, so that's been something I've been targeting down. People in playtests, they really want to use it, and I'll flip that card immediately. It's almost always the best card on the board still. And it's very easy to overlook passing the torch when you think, man, I need to hit rescue completed, or I'm never going to hit them anyway, right? My attacks will be all too slow, and what you really need to hit is you need to hit passing the torch and then survive. You don't need to try and get damage in on rescue completed. You need to get rid of their future value, because if you don't, they're going to go diamond hands, and every turn they live, they're going to accrue value for doing nothing while you expend resources. They're going to remain resource neutral, right? Was the big hubbub about the Momo deck is if you can stay resource neutral, if you can even plus off Precious Lesson, even better. That's where it all comes from. And a card like Passing the Torch helps you do that. It helps you stay resource neutral. For every foundation you build, a Passing the Torch kind of, replaces it in the long run. So the stock market defense is usually one where it looks like you're not playing defense. It usually involves being patient with your defense, and you don't typically get to do it for too many turns. If you are getting to pull it off for a bunch of turns, you probably have chaff hands that are being upgraded every turn, right? You're blocking with the little stuff out of your hand that you don't want. And these two combine really well. The trap card in the stock market, when I look at my hand and I'm like, man, I have these 2 attacks, but they really need an activator, but I also have this strong defensive ability. That's 3 cards. That's half my hand. This is when you'll catch me having 4 or 5 foundations and I still only build 1 or 2, right? This is a big hand kind of strategy where I'm it's close, but it's not quite there. I don't have something to bank in my momentum for later. It's a really explosive turn is just on the horizon, and I think a lot of players try to draw into those turns, right? They'll play their attack out, and then they'll just draw as many cards as they can and then build, and it's that one attack was still probably better than the one card you drew off Passing the Torch, just statistically, right? Just even if you're going to draw 2 cards, realistically, they're not going to be ones that compensate for losing that attack, even if you are getting more value onto your board. So that kind of dynamic is really the difference between, I think, the novice players, people understand the system mechanics, and people understand the game. If you understand the system mechanics, it's a good play. If you understand the game, it's super contextual to what you're trying to draw and what you're trying to get out of your hand. So playing the back alley haymaker, drawing 2 cards, one off itself, one off Passing the Torch, is almost always going to be your plays when you're at the level 0, maybe even the level 1, right? And it's just a generally overall great play. But for the stock market, we're trying to get the best possible hand, and that haymaker might be something that you don't have to use to block, or it might just be so much more useful next turn after you've sculpted a little bit more, after you've seen what your opponent can do, after your opponent chose not to attack you and pressure your hand at all, because your board looks fucking awesome. So the biggest payoff to having a good defensive board, to me, is that you get to go from sculpting to gambling. You get to go from trying to find those pieces to, baiting the opponent into expending resources that you don't have to expend. A lot of it is you don't have to respect their offense, right? Like, if you don't think that they can kill you, you can greedily hold these things. So it's definitely a risk, but it's the kind of thing where like the game is super even and you really gotta have like that explosive turn. You gotta get out of your flow state. Your trap cards aren't super effective anymore. Breaker 2, not the bone crushing keyword response it is turn 2 anymore. This is when you have to start thinking, all right, big swings, god hands, 6+ attacks, right? Like whatever it needs to be. This is like, do you have a hand that can kill through 2 copies of their best defensive ability? Right? Do you have a hand that can kill through double cheerful uppercut? Or is so good that they cannot even block with cheerful uppercut? Then you can go into the stock market phase. You can go find that hand, right? If you can survive like their best hands. And that's why it's risky, because you're giving them the same opportunities, but you want to prioritize not actually losing cards from your hand. You want to get paid for doing nothing at this point. And I think that this is a place where like the best decks get to. Like Kirishima gets paid for doing basically nothing. And once you get paid for doing nothing, you can do anything you want, essentially. It's such a weird phrase, I know, but like once you start getting that value for doing absolutely nothing, your opponent's going to have to overcorrect and react to almost everything you do after that point, especially once they notice that they're not really getting anything. They might be dealing damage, they might be getting momentum, but it's not really actually advancing the game state. It's not costing you resources. It might be a little spooky. So be careful when you're poking and you're like, all right, you're not blocking anything. Like, that's really a bait. That's if your opponent's at a high life total and you're sending like 5 mid-6s, they probably can block those. I hate to say it. And if they're not blocking it, that doesn't mean they're open, right? If they still got cards in hand, they still got ready foundations. They're probably just prioritizing the cards in their hand over 5 health right now, which means you need to strongly evaluate how many cards you're going to use for the rest of your turn. And then level 3 is the Pillow Fort zone. I want to be very clear, I don't think many decks ever get to this point. I don't think I ever get to this point. MHA, I think decks get to this point for like a turn. Momo probably gets to do it the most turns. You typically have to rebuild after you hit like this level, just because of the strong one-time use defensive abilities. So this is the late game, right? This is where we've turned the corner to late game, or you've taken people out to deep water. This is the deep water defense. Involves layers of effects or overwhelming speed hate / card draw. You gotta have or potentially reusable effects. So this is where you've got like an engine. This is like a defensive engine almost. Level 3 is where you feel the safest, right? Like level 3 is you've got all your pieces, you've got Faith Shield in hand, you've got probably a zone change, you've got card draw, you've got things like Fulfilled My Duty, and you can afford to use them. That's the most important thing. You've gotten paid for doing nothing long enough that the payoff is now that you have this defensive fortress that you can just sort of sit on and wait to accrue, and sculpt the best possible hand. And what makes this different than the stock market defense is that it not just relies on a good board presence, it is an overwhelming board presence, right? It is nearly unkillable. I hope this is how you spell presence. It's probably not. I'm sure I think there's a C in the middle, but I don't know where. So overwhelming board presence, right? And it has the kind of... It's not usually dependent on stopping power, right? Like these are... I should go back up here. So like the trap cards, right? It likes stopping power. These powerful defensive tools. It's focused on stopping power. But level 3 can take everything that you want to throw at it, right? Everything in the kitchen sink. It's when you feel you're most safe. At worst, you're going to partial something, It doesn't necessarily shut stuff down. Like Face Shield is great disruption on all of its symbols. Confused is great disruption for a lot of decks, especially decks that combo keyword to gain keyword. So that's a big thing, like shutting off stun 2 from the people who still play Capture Net. That's a big deal. If you have to prioritize enhances and responses while you have combos going on, that's a big one. Just any card that gains keywords confused hits, right? So like these are typically the kind of things that you have to build a deck to get to. Like I think the first 3 technically, right, like level 0, 1, and 2, most decks can just kind of ebb and flow between. These are like autopilots that I'll find myself in almost every deck. Air decks don't really have too many great trap cards, but what can you do? There's not, like, you get specialized sound waves to draw a card on defense, which people seem really surprised by. And you rely on Electric Jolt for like air decks. So that's like your trap card there, right? Is stopping power, Electric Jolt. And then like almost every deck that stalemates out that doesn't have like a clear advantage is going to hit a stock market moment. And this is like the pinnacle. This is like your deck has to be built to have a super defensive engine. And right now, I think the only decks that really hit this note are Momo, Eraserhead, potentially a Toru flashing stuff. That's a really strong defensive ability. And then, what's the other one? There's one more deck I think can kind of get there. Midnight, I think, is the one, because a lot of the good attacks have keywords. And she has great filter and stuff like that, so getting to the pieces is a big deal. But she's definitely way better at the trap card game, right? Like Chaos has the trap cards, and then they have such good dunks for like that gambling moment where you're like, all right, I'll finally start taking damage. And again, 6-handers are way better at this, right? So when you get to the Pillow Fort stage, you're just kind of cruising. You're just trying not to use all your resources. You're pretty much at your leisure. And again, I think like Eraserhead doesn't get to stay at this level, right? You can pressure stuff out of this board state, but that's why you really need like reusable effects to stay there. And so the way that this kind of helps me is that if I can think ahead, I can do this work already by activating the autopilot and tell myself, okay, look, right now I'm prioritizing staying alive. I want to get to a point where I can start using my board state to pressure my opponent. So what does that look like? What do I need to prioritize next turn? Like, how much health can I give up early on at level 0 to usually get to this level, to the stock market, to where I can make my opponent take 1 turn off is a big part of it, right? That's usually what I want. I want them to take 1 turn off, and then I can transition to a point where I'm at 10 foundations, and I can either threaten to shoot up to a number that will survive deadlock threats or cancel them or whatever, and start waiting for like the best hand I can possibly get. And recognizing that like the cards that are best at level 0 are almost always +1 mids. You know, recognizing that my trap cards need to have a backswing. I need to have a good attack in my hand before I use Cheerful Uppercut on your first attack. You know, I think this is the number one place where like new players don't understand why they're not winning. Because I see them use Cheerful Uppercut and they're like, oh man, you still killed me through it anyway. Or, you know, they use their Cheerful Uppercut and they use their Cheerful Uppercut and they use their Cheerful Uppercut 3 turns in a row and they're like, yeah, I'm doing it. I'm staying alive. But they're -1 hand size. They never get the momentum to use it offensively. They never put anything in front of it to pressure me. They always do it on my first attack, no matter how fast it is. You know, that's how they still get killed, right? They always do it early on, and so I don't waste any of my actual combo pieces. I don't lose my second attack because I already have a face down now, and I'm just gonna build. I might even just end my turn, and they're like, yes, you only played 1 card. That's not good. That's not necessarily a good thing. It looks really good because I didn't improve my board state. It looks really good because you're not taking any more damage. But that is potentially very scary that I have all these cards in my hand that I'd rather keep. You know? It oftentimes means that at least one of them is a defensive bomb and the rest are attacks, right? Like, people typically throw out, you know, a foundation or 2 just to progress that board state, just to get the card flow going, just to make sure they don't get smoked in resources or caught up to if they went first. And what it should really tell you a good majority of the time is that they probably have all the block zones. They probably have every zone covered, right? If they're going to hold a whole bunch of cards, just statistically if they have every zone, but especially if they choose not to play out any other cards, they're almost certainly holding one of those to make sure that they have the right zone. So it is a super strong card, and again, limiting your opponent to not attacking and being jammed and, you know, not being able to build resources is good. You just need to recognize that, like, what you get out of this is not your turn to attack. What you get out of that play, of them playing 1 attack and passing, is you get to outbuild them now. You get to jam them with that hand and outbuild them. And if it is just the absolute super nutty, you know, awesome attack hand, well, they lost their leadoff, right? They lost their 1 leadoff. And so the likelihood that they just get a equivalent or better leadoff attack to this already awesome hand isn't so great. So give them that turn. Make them see if they review, right? Then they come back. They have 1 less card. They don't review. They draw another card. Yeah, you're probably in trouble. But if you just attacked a bunch and then they face tank it and you never present lethal, or you make them block with like 1 attack, but you expend a bunch of resources and you tap out, you know, they already had the hand. They already sculpted. They already told you that they're at this stage, that they're prioritizing a win condition. They've already told you that they either have trap cards or that they're prioritizing their win condition, right? So that's when you need to pivot, and that's when the autopilot really helps me, is when I just recognize the different phases of people playing cards at me. So I don't know if this was very, very concise or very helpful, but I hope it helped you guys out there. If you have any questions for me in the chat or any questions for anyone on YouTube, please feel free to leave a comment. I'll do my best to answer it. But this is something I've been thinking about, something I brought up, but I've never really fleshed out. So this is my first time fleshing it out for you guys. And I hope you enjoy.